Good morning. Thank you for joining us again for another Jagged Globe presentation. My name is Tom Briggs. I'm the Marketing Director at Jagged Globe. I'm based here in Sheffield, UK, and today I'm very pleased to have Expedition Leader David Hamilton with us. In a career spanning more than 30 years, David has led more than 100 climbing, trekking and skiing expeditions, visiting almost all of the world's great mountain ranges. He has climbed each of the 7 summits at least 3 times, including 10 ascents of Mt Everest and 23 ascents of Mt Vinson in Antarctica. David's led more than 30 expeditions to peaks over 7,000 meters. At the start of this year, he spent 66 days making a ski crossing of the Pyrenees from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. So this morning, David's going to talk to us about the mountains of the Karakoram in northern Pakistan. This is an area that he knows really well from numerous visits there over the past 3 decades. So the format of today's session will be a 40-minute presentation followed by up to 20 minutes of Q&A. So I'm just going to bring David in now. So David's at home in the village of Hartshill in Midlands, England, with his partner Claire. When he's not leading expeditions or working the Antarctic summer season, he splits his time between the UK and France, where he has a place in the Ekran. So good morning, David.
Good morning, Tom.
How are you this morning?
Yeah, fine. It's a lovely sunny day.
Good, good. I know you've been getting out on your road bike quite a bit. How does it compare cycling around the Midlands compared to the Alps?
Well, my bike is the one I bought to commute to university with 40 years ago, and yet the day before yesterday I had 3 punctures in the one day. So the bike I've got in France is a bit more modern.
Right, 3 punctures. That's pretty unlucky. So we'll dive straight into your Karakoram presentation. So I'll just bring the slides across. Yeah. Okay, over to you.
Right. I think, as everyone knows, the mountains of the Karakoram in Pakistan have got some of the world's most recognizable and iconic mountains, like K2, which you're looking at the moment. The next picture. I have been using my time in lockdown looking through my extensive collection of pictures taken over 30 years, basically scanning old slides and putting together a few new talks. And I came across this picture, which I hadn't seen for a while. This is 1987, my first visit to the mountains of the Karakoram. At this point, I had an office job in London. I took the summer off, and together with 3 friends, we went out to the Karakoram for a few months. We did an awful lot of things wrong. We got avalanched off a mountain. We ran out of food. But I did get to see views like this, and you've got, this is a 6,500 meter peak, but we almost managed to climb in the Houché region, about 25 miles south of K2. And in the skyline, we've got K2, Broad Peak, and 2 of the Gasherbrum peaks. And it was really the experience on this expedition that made me realize I didn't want to spend the rest of my life doing an office job in London when I could spend it in the mountains. So from this time on, I set about organizing and leading treks and expeditions for the first decade only in the Karakoram, and then broadening to other places. Have the next picture. Looking at the mountains of Asia from this perspective, you can see there's an arc running all the way from Bhutan through Nepal, northern India, the Hindu Kush branches off, the Pamirs, the Tian Shan, and these half a dozen different countries, all of which have got different cultures and many mountains. and Jagged Globe have been leading expeditions to all these countries since its inception. So this is just one way of showing that these Himalayan peaks are quite connected. Moving on to kind of Pakistan specific, heading from the east, the mountains can be broken into three sections. There's the big 8,000 meter peaks, which are accessed from Skardu. Then the central section, accessed from Gilgit. The Karakoram highway heads north to the Chinese frontier, and those are the Hunza peaks. And then over on the western side, from the town of Chitral, you have the Hindu Kush Mountains. And so these are the three areas that make up the mountains of northern Pakistan. We go to these countries primarily to climb the mountains, but each of them have a different history and culture, and that's something that we obviously pick up on while we're there. So these are just a couple of shots before I go into specific mountains about what you can expect in the north of Pakistan. This is in the Hunza region, Baltit 4 above Karimabad. This is the most easily road accessible part. For many years, the historic buildings in Pakistan were neglected, and you weren't able to really visit palaces the way you could in other parts of the Himalaya. But in the last few decades, a lot of these have been renovated, and there's now a bit more of the culture and history accessible. Clearly, this is now a Muslim area, but in the past was Buddhist, so there are some Buddhist things to see. And the quality of hotels, which used to be a bit ropey, have improved. This is in Hunza again, showing there are now some decent hotels in the mountain areas. One other unique thing about the Karakoram is that the roads go quite close to many of the major mountains. This is Gasherbrum, 7,800 meters, and this picture is taken from where you can drive to, unlike other parts of the Himalayas where the bigger peaks involve quite a bit of a hike. Some of the Pakistan peaks can be seen from close to the road. As with traveling to the Khumbu, excuse me, in Nepal, most trips to Pakistan start with an internal flight from Islamabad. You fly up to Skardu, but instead of a small propeller aircraft, it's a large jet aircraft. The flight takes just under an hour, and you get this good view of Nanga Parbat as you fly by. So on the K2 base camp trip, if the weather's good on the flight, as well as seeing 4 8,000 meter peaks from base camp, you can see one from the flight. This is the garden of the K2 Hotel in Skardu, which is the starting off point for most of the expeditions. A nice garden to relax in the sun, both before and after the expedition. And looking from the garden, you see the Indus River flowing by. And for those of you that have done any traveling or climbing in Ladakh, this will look very similar. This is the Indus that flows through Leh, and as the crow flies, it's only 140 miles, so a little under 200 kilometers distance from Leh to Skardu. What I'm going to talk about now are the 4 expeditions which Jagged Globe had planned for this summer, and they're all being carried over to next year. So we've tried to go for a clearly there are hundreds of mountains and many areas you could go trekking in the Karakoram. We're trying to offer an 8,000 meter peak, a 7,000 meter peak, 6,000 meter peak, and a trek. So Spantik, just before we move on to the next picture, this shows the entire route, and I think it's the most interesting 7,000 meter peak I've climbed. In the bottom left corner, there's a green patch, and that's base camp at 4,300 meters. It goes up the rocky ridge to Camp 1, and then along the ridge to Camp 2, Camp 3's at the top of the snow, and then on to the summit. The whole length is 8 kilometers, and all the way along, there's great views down on either side. So I think it's a really interesting peak to climb. Next. I had led 3 previous expeditions in the mid-2000s, 2005-6, but then we stopped visiting Pakistan until I went back in 2018 for a private trip, and then this is the 2019 group going to Spantik. A real mix of experience. Some people I knew from other places. A couple of people have summited Everest. A couple of people have done 7 summits. So a very experienced group. An interesting 3-day walk into base camp. We're leaving the village of Arandu at 2,700 meters. And instead of jumping straight to base camp, I've included a couple of shots of the trek, because this is really representative of the type of trekking you would see in most parts of the Karakoram. Between 3,000 and 4,000 meters, these large glaciers dominate. The track sometimes is on the glacier and sometimes in these ablation valleys along the side. Not a busy area. We didn't see anyone on this 3-day trek to base camp. The first 2 days are on the ablation valley along the side of the glacier, and then the 3rd day moves out walking across this dry glacier. Not particularly easy walking, but not particularly difficult. You know, clearly everyone's using poles for balance. These glacier walks do get a bit harder in the afternoon when the snow melts. And then base camp, a spectacular base camp on this grassy knoll overlooking the ice down below at a height of 4,360 meters.
Would the only other people you see around here, David, be other climbers, or are there people trekking in this area as well?
These valleys are pretty quiet, and the whole time we were there, we maybe saw 20 or 25 other people. Half of these were other expeditions, so like 10 people who were on climbing expeditions. And on the way out, we did meet 2 or 3 small trekking groups with 5 or 6 people. So a bit of a mix, but far fewer than you'd see in most other popular areas.
Sure.
Probably the hardest part of the climb is the route up the rock. You see people wearing helmets, that there are a few loose stones around. Some parts this is straightforward, some parts a little bit of scrambling on the rocky ridge. So clearly the first time we went up, there were quite a few loose rocks, but after we made 2 or 3 journeys, we kicked them out of the way. It got a bit safer. So the most challenging part of this ascent is actually the rock bit between base camp and camp 1, rather than on the snow. And then at just over 5,000 meters, we get to the top of that rock ridge and move on to the site of camp 1, which is just 5 minutes from the end of the climb. Nice tent platforms, fairly comfortable, spacious, good view all round. And as is often the case in the Karakoram, because it's so warm in the summer, it's finding the best time to move is avoiding the heat of the sun. Moving in the dark, that's why I don't have any pictures, because we tried to do it in the dark between camp 1 and camp 2. This is camp 2, 5,500 meters, the view all the way down the glacier we've come. We made 2 trips up here, an acclimatization trip and then a summit push. And here the weather looks absolutely lovely as our high altitude porter team set off to fix the ropes to camp 3, which they succeeded in getting most of the way there before the bad weather hit us. It started snowing substantially, and to cut a long story short, we were unable to continue to the top. And a rather disappointed team beating a retreat in quite deep snow back down the ridge. Very frustrating because it was the trip was really well organised. We had everything we needed. We had a good team of high altitude porters, strong climbers, and out of my previous 3 expeditions to Spantik, we had got to the summit twice. So a picture here from one of the earlier trips.
I mean, just on the weather, I mean, we've actually moved the Spantik expedition a bit earlier in the season, haven't we? I mean, you know, can you just explain the sort of the season in the Karakoram? Because obviously we're used to climbing either side of the monsoon in Nepal, but you know, people seem to sort of go out to Pakistan, you know, mid-June or early June even, if they're going to.
Yeah, certainly the trekking season is June, July, August, September. As long as you're not going, when you start getting above 5,500 meters trying to cross passes, there could be too much snow in June. You kind of want that to go. It's generally warmer than it would be in Nepal, and there's no monsoon. You can get a couple of days of rain and up above 5,500, 6,000 meters, that will be snow. And that could pretty much happen anytime, June, July, August, September. There are subtleties depending whether you're climbing a route that's mostly rock or mostly snow, whether it's better being later or earlier. Certainly last summer in the Karakoram got very warm, and therefore I think people are, while July, August have always been popular months, I think there's maybe going to be a bit of a tendency moving a little earlier into June, July to try and avoid the heat.
Sure.
Oh, we've gone back to the beginning.
No, this is K2.
Oh! Okay, you know the pictures better than me.
Yeah.
And it is a different K2 shot.
Slightly different shot, yeah.
I'm going to talk now about the trek into K2 base camp, which is far and away the most popular trek, I would say, of international visitors going to the mountains of Pakistan. There are some who are just traveling and will do a 2 or 3 day hike. There are plenty of those. But for anybody going for a long trek, let's say of more than a week's duration, I would say 70–75% do the K2 base camp trek. It does show you the most spectacular mountains in Pakistan, but over the decades I've been going, it has clearly become busier. So there are, if you want wilderness treks in Pakistan where you won't meet many people, there's plenty of them. If you do go on the K2 trek, you do need to appreciate it is the one busy trek in the Karakoram. Okay, next picture. As with many of these trips in the eastern part of Pakistan Karakoram, it will start from Skardu, this is the garden of the K2. The jeep journey to the roadhead is a major part of almost every trek or climb in the Karakoram. Some people think it's the most exciting part of the trip, and other people think it's the most scary. The roads are being improved, but they are narrow, subject to landslides. The drivers are all pretty capable and the vehicles are pretty well maintained. But when we do get to the more dangerous bits, it's common practice to get out and walk for a few hundred yards just to avoid the more dangerous bits. The first couple of days hike on the K2 trek, you're starting walking at 3,000 meters, and it can be very hot. People who are used to hiking in Nepal have told me that the Karakoram at these lower altitudes is warmer. So you do need to bring clothing that you'd wear for summer hiking in lower alpine valleys. The first couple of days are below the rocks, and then you get up into the more rocky terrain. You will be sharing campsites with other groups. There's usually enough space for everybody to get all the sleeping tents and all the mess tents up. Typically 4, 5, 6 hours walking in a day. If it's going to be cloudy, you can split that between the morning and the afternoon. If it looks like it's going to be warm, it might be a good idea to do an early start and try and finish it all before lunch. A good half of this trek is on the glacier, where the path will change from year to year, and the path is really just following a line of cairns. It's not a built path as such, as clearly the melting ice causes the stones to move. And while these days walking are on the glacier, for the first couple of days, the campsite is on the ablation valley at the side.
So would you say that in terms of the sort of terrain underfoot, it's more difficult than something like the Everest base camp trek?
Yeah, certainly. I think for people who've trekked or done the Everest base camp trek, the best way to understand this, it's almost as if you drive to Gorak Shep, and then all the walking you do is on the terrain which you would experience between Gorak Shep and Everest base camp. This ice covered in stones, and common to walk with poles for support. I'm quite happy walking this in stout shoes, but many people prefer ankle support of light hiking boots. And the campsites from now on are on the glacier. So together the porters help clear platforms, and we put the tents up. So
presumably at the start of every season, each sort of camping area gets rebuilt almost?
Yes, and even during the season.
Yeah.
I will say a word about porters, as we hire a lot of porters and we spend a lot of time with them. A typical trekking group will have roughly 4 or 5 porters per Western member, so 10 trekkers and we could have 50 porters, whereas an expedition can have anything between 10 or 15 porters. Some of my larger expeditions, we had 150 porters accompanying us to base camp, which from the leader's point of view is quite a bit of organising, but for the team members, having these guys with us and resting up every afternoon, there is the opportunity to talk with them, learn about their life, their culture, and some of the places we go to, there's not so much interaction with local people anymore. You leave their village and then you're in the mountain with only your cook crew, whereas here we're spending all our time with these guys that were in the mountains, and the ability to talk to them and learn about their society is another plus of the expedition. And as Tom said a minute ago, that there isn't really a path, and the further up you get, this is the final day into Concordia, where these glacial meltwater streams exist, and you do need to be quite careful getting across these not to slip. So not good trails. But then this is what you've travelled for. As we approach Concordia, we get these really stunning views of some of the world's highest mountains. This is Gasherbrum IV, which is just a fraction under 8,000 meters. And just poking up on the right-hand side, you can see the summit of Gasherbrum II. This is the only point on the K2 trek that you do get to see G2. From the same site, we're looking at Broad Peak. And then Mustag Tower. Gasherbrum seen from the north, the picture of it from the south, the square top is much more familiar. This is what it looks like from the Baltoro side. And then finally, K2. There's a number of ways that we can tweak the program depending on any days we've lost due to bad weather, what we want to do with rest days, but it is normally possible from this site at Concordia to do a one-day round trip and actually go all the way to the bottom of K2 base camp, meet some of the expeditions there, and visit the Gilkey Memorial.
Yeah, I know you're going to talk about G2, Gasherbrum II in a few minutes, but just to come back to that, we've slightly changed our itinerary, haven't we, for the K2 base camp to actually visit the Gasherbrum II base camp?
Yes, that's the plan, because I will be with the Jagged Globe team at Gasherbrum Base Camp. So the aim is for the K2 Base Camp trek to come and overnight and spend one night with the climbers at Gasherbrum Base Camp, which is another day's walk from here, off on the right.
Great.
And we'll just finish this with what used to, when I started visiting K2 Base Camp, the vast majority of people went up and down the Baltoro, and the option of going over the Gondokoro La, which is just under 5,600 meters, was seen as only being for more capable, more experienced groups. It has now become more normal for groups to go over the Gondokoro La, but it's not a straightforward, or if you're very lucky with the conditions, it could be straightforward and easy, and people who've never been on snow have done it. However, in order to guarantee a high chance of success with a high level of safety, it's necessary to take proper climbing equipment, crampons, ice axes, helmets, ropes, which our groups do. And the exit from the Baltoro Concordia over the Gondokoro La gives this fantastic view of the peaks in the Houchet region and the opportunity to see a different valley system. Right, moving on to G2. I've led 4 expeditions, and this is the most recent one, 2009. Because we go in much earlier in the season, in June, the Baltoro has got a lot more snow on it. This is our large porter group on the way to base camp. Base camp can be quite comfortable. We're going to be here a few weeks, so we spend a fair bit of time moving the stones aside, an individual tent for each climber, and we make it comfortable because we're going to be here a while. And obviously, during the course of the expedition, there will be some snow, and it's good to have a comfortable mess tent to retreat to. And this is an extra large mess tent, which I bought in Britain many years ago, and it's served all my major Pakistani expeditions. We're able to set up the dining at one side, and there's a big free area on the other side that we can use for preparing loads going to the high camp when the weather's bad outside. It gives us some good inside working space. The route up to Camp 1 is through an ice fall, a bit steeper lower down, and then gets gentle higher up. Camp 1 is just about pretty much 6,000 meters, just a touch below. And just behind it, you can see the steepest section on the climb, just to the right of that rock tower, is known as the Banana Ridge, and that's fixed ropes set up there. And at the top of that, there's 2 possible sites just under 6,500 meters where we have Camp 2. This some people moving up the fixed ropes on the lower section of that Banana Ridge climb.
And is that ridge, I mean, is that subject to avalanche risk if there's a lot of snow? No,
that's one of the good things, you know, given that there is going to be summer snowfall, the route on Gasherbrum II, certainly as far as Camp 2, is quite avalanche safe. Clearly, if there was an awful lot of snow falling and you were in Camp 2, you might have to wait a day or two for things to subside. But because it's on a ridge, anything that would come from higher up would go on either side. Above the route above Camp 2, you do need to wait out avalanche conditions. So this is there's 2 Camp 2s. That's the lower one. This picture is taken from the upper one. Said 6,500 meters with a view over to Gasherbrum 1, showing the route up. And yeah, not great conditions there in 2009. Ali Raza, our most experienced high altitude porter, and myself went from Camp 2 up to Camp 3 to fix some rope and prepare the route. We got to Camp 3, looking down, you can see pretty much that everything's blanketed in a lot of fresh snow. So there was a fair bit of deep snow on the way up to Camp 3 at 7. And here, one tent we established at 7,000 meters, hoping to return. But we then got hit with a fair bit of snowfall, burying the tents at Camp 2. We had to wait for things to subside, went down, and the weather didn't improve that summer, and nobody until very, very late in the season, after we'd all gone home, got to the top that year. But that was a big disappointment for me, because on my previous 3 expeditions to Gasherbrum II, we'd summited every time with almost all the team members getting up. We had an incredibly high success rate, and I was hoping to repeat that in 2009. So my coming return next summer is a bit of a grudge match to try and get the average up, and hopefully get most of the team onto the top, where in good conditions you get fantastic views. The peak in the background is Nanga Parbat, which has to be 100 miles away.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the terrain between Camp 3 and the summit on G2?
Yeah, it's not fixed. It's not particularly steep, 10, 15 degrees. We essentially walk it, not usually roped up. It gets a little steeper on the final 200 meters, and we usually fix 50 meters, sometimes 100, just on that final section. So we're quite free to move. It's not that we're constrained on a rope, possibly behind other parties. It's a high altitude snow hike with an ice axe in one hand, a ski pole in the other, and we only really fix the very top section.
Right. So the steeper ground is actually lower down, yeah, on that banana ridge.
Between Camp 1 and Camp 2 is the steepest snow. Yeah.
Great.
So, as I said at the beginning, we're trying to offer a representative sample of the types of trekking and mountaineering that can be done in the Karakoram. And we are aware, because of the popularity of South American trips that can be done in 2 weeks, that there are many people who love visiting the mountains of the world, but struggle to get more than 2 weeks leave. A 6,000 meter peak in 2 weeks, you need to think about acclimatization. But we have come up with this peak, which is just a 2-hour drive from Skardu, and therefore we're able to do it in just a little over 2 weeks. I've not personally been there, but Sharif, a guide I've worked with for a decade, he climbed this mountain in June 2019 with 2 Austrian climbers, and he took these pictures on his mobile phone, which is why they're a little pixelated. The quality is not as good as some of mine, but this gives the impression that it's a pretty straightforward mountain. We're going to do it with a base camp at 3,800 meters, 2 further camps, one at 4,800, this one at 5,200, meaning that the summit climb is only 800 meters across what I think is pretty benign terrain. So we're hoping to have a 6,000 meter peak that can be climbed in 18, 19 days from the UK without any hazardous terrain. And this is Sharif's picture on the top. So that's going to be towards the end of the season, after the G2 group is over. I'll be back to Skardu sorting the equipment, and then our final trip of the season will be this one, Kosagang.
And just to say, I mean, you and I worked a bit, didn't we, on the itinerary, because it's only, if you're acclimatized, you could walk into base camp in a couple of days from Skardu. But yeah, we just wanted to make sure that we had enough time early on to sort of, whilst it is really accessible, to kind of have a realistic acclimatization program.
Yes, it is all about the acclimatization. And finally, you'll probably drink less alcohol on a climbing trip in Pakistan than you would to most other places in the world. For anyone who's hoping for an expedition detox, it's the ideal place to go. But there is one place in Islamabad where you can have a beer at the end of the expedition, and if you come with me, I'll take you there. And if Tom's budget will stretch to, I'll buy everyone in the team a can of Pakistani beer. So to finish, for people who love traveling in the mountains, whether you go to hike among them and look at the views, or whether you go to climb to the summits, the Karakoram has, I think, the most impressive range of mountains you can either look at or climb. And this kind of enhanced aerial shot gives an impression of some of the major peaks and how they relate to each other. Quite different from, people that have been to Nepal and Pakistan appreciate them both. The Karakoram is a fair bit more rugged. You're not going to come across the same amount of villages and cattle herders and people in the mountains. So it's more remote from a human point of view, and also just, I think, more rugged geographically. The steep granite faces, the steep ice faces seem to be crammed a bit closer to each other, and when you get near to them, you really are impressed by the majesty of the peaks. But with these 4 trips that we're offering next summer, we're hoping to have something for everybody of the range of possibilities. And as the years go ahead, we're looking forward to introducing treks to popular areas, treks to unpopular areas, and climbs of 6,000, 7,000 and 8,000 meter mountains. We've got the logistics and infrastructure to take climbs to any of these places. It's really just a question of what our climbing customers want to visit. If you can let us know, then we can put the trips together. So that's, I hope for those that have been there, that's brought up some memories. And for those who haven't, I've given you an introduction as to some of the delights available in the Karakoram.
Thank you, David. No, that was great. I think for anybody like myself, who's not been to northern Pakistan, that just gives you even more desire to go there. So we're going to move on to questions now. So if anybody wants to usually the Q&A function to ask David about the Karakoram, or indeed any other mountain, as we said at the start, he's climbed the 7 summits sort of three times, 10 times to the top of Everest. So if you've got any questions for David, then fire away in the Q&A form and I'll put them to him. I mean, I've got one, David. Obviously, you've been to done lots of expeditions to the Karakoram over the years. I mean, K2's become I guess offered as what you might call a commercial expedition. Increasingly over the last few years, it's been climbed. What's your sort of view on that, really, in terms of more people going there?
Yes, it's an interesting one. As long as the staff working on the expedition, and they're partly Sherpas and partly local Pakistanis, are competent and capable, and the climbers are competent and capable, it's probably manageable. I am worried that a fair number of climbers buying places on trips really can't look after themselves and shouldn't be there. And also a fair number of the staff, I suppose you could say that all the Nepalis coming pretty much know what they're doing. The best Pakistani porters are able to do a good job. There are some cheaper, lower skill level Pakistanis who are dangerous to themselves and others. And unfortunately, a great part of the route is subject to stonefall, either naturally occurring or kicked down by other people. anybody commercially taking customers to K2 has to accept that over the years, some of them are going to die. Now, whether it's 2%, 5%, 10%, it is hard to say. But commercial operators on other 8,000 meter mountains, you're unlucky to have fatalities. If things are run well, you should have a safe trip. And you could not offer that on K2. Therefore, I think it's, as a business, if you're taking people away knowing that you're going to be bringing back dead people every year, every second year, that's quite a big ask. And it doesn't quite fit with the business model that I've worked with for my career. Perhaps if I'd been 20 years younger and a bit more aggressive and prepared to push it, I'd be happy to guide K2. I actually turned down 2 offers from different companies to guide K2 because I just felt that I'd survived an awful lot of mountains, and I wanted to carry on enjoying them and not stick my neck out unnecessarily.
Sure. Okay, so we've got some questions here. Richard's asking, what's it like culturally these days? As Westerners, do you feel welcome in Pakistan?
Certainly, that even in the cities, you walk down the street, people come up to you, hello, where are you from? I think in India and Nepal, maybe India more than Nepal, if someone comes up to you in the street, they're probably going to try and sell you something because there's enough tourists around. People realize tourists have money. In Pakistan, there are so few Westerners that the vast majority of people are genuinely surprised to see you there and friendly and just want to ask where you're from and what you're doing. And once you get into the mountains, the staff we work with are very similar in outlook to the cook team you'd have in India or Bhutan or Nepal, and interactions with the staff really make these trips.
Great. Now Dora's got a question here, just to come back to Gasherbrum II, asking what sort of experience should someone have before you would take them to G2?
Yeah, that's in a sense that the main skill you need is living in a tent for a long time. And if you haven't, where do you get that? Clearly, any trip that involves plenty of camping, and especially camping on the mountain rather than base camp, being organized and looking after yourself in the tent is almost the most important skill. We do have staff on the mountains to carry the loads. You'll be expected to carry your own sleeping bag, some of your personal clothing, could be 10 kilos. It gets very sunny, you take your jacket off, it could go up to 15, but generally you're not expected to carry big loads, so that shouldn't wear you down. I think pacing, and for people who've only ever done a 3-week or a 4-week expedition, at some point, you are going to have to do your first 2-month expedition. And the only way you'll learn if you're able to look after yourself and pace yourself is on it. I think I'd say if you've been on a 6,000 meter peak, and you found that you generally perform, you're one of the stronger people in the group, you didn't find it too difficult, then yes, moving on to 7,000, 8,000 meters is the way forward. I'm not sure you can prescriptively come up with a list of the exact things you have to do to get the skills. If you feel that you're pretty good at what you're doing and it works on the other trips you've been on, at some point you may want to step up and try just doing the same things on a bigger canvas.
Yeah, it's interesting. Last week, Robert Anderson was talking about Everest and saying that one of the most important things really was your, how good you were on your feet, your crampon technique, because that efficiency was obviously, significant over the long duration of the expedition, and obviously climbing a mountain of that sort of height. And you're talking about being able to look after yourself. It almost sounds really simple, but I suppose the way you find out is to go and have a go. As long as you've got the fundamental skills, then there's only one way to find out how you're going to perform on a long expedition to a very high mountain.
Yeah, and clear, all the people who come climbing with us are fit and healthy and active. But these long expeditions, you do have to change. Some I have seen people fail, people who are very fit, technically capable, just fade away on 8,000 meter mountains because they struggle to eat. In order to be fit and active, we are the sort of people who do not stuff our faces every time food is put in front of us. And yet you have to unlearn that these decades of what is good practice at home, you have to unlearn that and just systematically overeat, sometimes things that you don't particularly like. And if you don't do that, if you find you're losing 3, 4, 5 kilos halfway through the expedition, you're not going to be able to summit. So looking after yourself in your tent, keeping your clothes clean, changing your socks, eating extra helpings of rice and curry when you're not that hungry. If you can do all these things, the climbing probably isn't that different from the type of climbing you've done in other places.
Sure. I mean, to sort of lead on from that, John here is asking, do you have a specific exercise regime before going to altitude? What do you do before heading off on these expeditions?
I think it's very different for different people. Some people who know they're going to lose a couple of kilos will actually overeat, and this is particularly true on Everest expeditions, but I don't see why it shouldn't apply to other 8,000 meters. A lot of people think, oh, in the months running up, I'm going to do more cycling, more running, I'm going to arrive really lean and fit. Whereas the people who've done it before sometimes arrive a bit tubby and say, well, you know what, I've not done much the last couple of weeks because I know that. The good thing about the longer expedition is the training is essentially the walk-in. You've got more than a week of a walk to base camp. You've got a few trips up to Camp 1 and Camp 2. That's where you get fit and ready for the summit. If you arrive on day 1 as if you've trained for a marathon and you're ready to go that day, you've peaked too early because the actual summit day isn't going to be for 5 or 6 weeks. So I'm not saying that these trips are ideal for couch potatoes who are a few kilos too heavy. Clearly, doing a moderate amount of exercise in the weeks and months running up to the expedition are not bad, but I wouldn't stress about overtraining, and I wouldn't stress about have a few second helpings in the weeks and months leading up to the trip, particularly if from previous expeditions you've learned that you're one of those people who tend to lose a little bit of weight.
Sure. Okay. Somebody's asked, I'd really like to visit the Karakoram, but the heat puts me off as someone who prefers cooler weather. How hot does it actually get when moving between camps on the 7,000 and 8,000 meter peaks?
There's almost kind of two questions there, the kind of trekking altitude and the climbing altitude. On the climbing, we are clearly different leaders have used their own experience. I hate moving in the heat. I get sunburn and I just get knackered. On my trips, we try and do as much climbing as possible, essentially in the dark and in the first hour or two after light. It's not uncommon moving, let's say, between Camp 2 and Camp 3 or Camp 1 and Camp 2 to be moving by 2 or 3 a.m. And if it's a 5 or 6 hour journey, we're hoping to be stopped about 7 or 8 in the morning. So I do not walk in the heat. There's two reasons. One, the heat's really unpleasant, and also the snow gets soft and you sink in. So on the climbing trips, almost all the climbing is planned to avoid being out in the heat. At trekking altitudes, is very variable. If you've got a cloudy day, then you can walk fine right into the, and once you're above 4,000 meters, the air's a bit cooler. So the hot days on trekking tend to just be in the 3,000 to 4,000 meter zone, and that'll only be 2 or 3 days at the beginning. And if it does look like a clear weather forecast and it's going to be sunny, we'd aim to have an early breakfast and get moving. Most British trekkers and climbers that I've worked with do not like working in excessive heat. Therefore, the itinerary, the day-by-day itinerary is altered to move around that. And we often see the Southern Europeans, the Italians and the Spanish like arriving in the middle of the day when it's really hot, and because they seem to not suffer so much.
Got a couple of sort of more general questions here. Carol's asking, saying, very interesting talk, thanks. What would be your recommendation for a Himalayan trek for someone who has done Everest Base Camp?
Well, the most popular trek in the Karakoram is the one to K2 base camp. You know, it's if you only go to the Karakoram once and you don't go to CK2, then your friends will ask kind of what you did. And I think most people going to Pakistan, as long as they can, because it is 3.5 weeks, as long as you can get that time, would go to do that. And then if you think you really like the area, you'd like to see some of the more remote places, then there are other ones to do. You know, some people go to K2 base camp and they think, you know what, I really love Nepal, and all their other trips they go back to Nepal. You know, that's fine. If you've enjoyed Nepal but you'd like to see a different culture in a different part of the Himalayas, that's where places like Pakistan or northern India, you know, there are good treks in northern India. The stands moving into Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, although there's good trekking terrain there, on the whole, most people I know tend to go to climb the mountains. But there are, and then you've got Mongolia, you've got the north side of the Karakoram in China. The trekking experience in all these places is different. And I can't honestly say that any one's better than the other. People have their preferences. But most people, I think, just enjoy the variety. And in a 10-year trekking career, at the end of which they would like to say, you know what, I've trekked in every country in the Himalayas that's got mountains. I love them all and they're all different.
Okay, Mark has got another sort of general question really about, you know, trekking and climbing. He's saying, you know, to progress from trekking to climbing, what climb would you recommend for a beginner? So I guess his means a sort of, you know, maybe a first expedition.
Yeah, that's good. I would say if you've done trekking and you aspire to do mountaineering, learn your skills in Britain or the Alps. It's closer, it's cheaper, it doesn't use as much time, and you get more hours of technical terrain, you know, for your money. The thing about Himalayan trips, you could go on a 1-month trip to climb a 6,000 meter peak, and of that month, you'd only spend 1 day with crampons on. So you might get to the top if it's not too difficult, but you've not really learnt much about climbing. Whereas if you go on a week's course in the Alps and the conditions are good, you can spend 5 or 6 days out with ropes, crampons, ice axes, really get confident with your skills. So when you go to a peak in the Himalayas, you've actually got a couple of days good quality technical stuff behind you and you can deploy it.
Great. Okay, so if anybody else wants to ask any more questions, fire away now. There's one here from Cam. Is the Murray Brewery still brewing beer?
Yeah, that's a really interesting, I'll take a diversion here. In 1947, when the state of Pakistan was founded, clearly the Murray Brewery was set up in British colonial times by a Farsi family, Zoroastrians, and they were allowed by their religion to brew alcohol. They were very worried, and in an Islamic country, they wouldn't be allowed to brew. So the Islamic court was set up in Pakistan at independence, and the very first case they heard was the Zoroastrian family asking if it was permitted for them to continue brewing alcohol, and the judgment was yes. So they are allowed to sell it in Pakistan, but only to the Christian and Zoroastrian community. So there aren't shops. If you're a resident non-Muslim, you can purchase, but there is one bar in a 5-star hotel in Islamabad that will sell you genuine Murray beer.
Okay. Okay, so I think we'll just take this final question from Graham. Does Spantik, so this is back to Spantik, the 7,000er, does it have fixed ropes, and what's the steepest gradient?
Yes, we fix ropes between Camp 2 and Camp 3, It's not, oh dear, hard to, these things always look steep, and they are. I'd say 30, 35 degrees. As long as it's soft snow, it's terrain that you probably wouldn't want or wouldn't need to fix rope on. But we are concerned that some years it can be a bit icy, and especially carrying a rucksack on a big slope, we put in a few 100 meters of rope. But it's and then the summit, we fix 50 or 100 meters just below the summit, which is maybe 35, 40 degrees. So it's more, I think I'd say it's more steep snow walking with the rope as a hand line, rather than jumaring up, vertical ice on, hanging onto the rope for dear life.
Sure.
It's more a safety line than a fixed rope ascent.
Got it. Excellent. Okay, that's brilliant. I think we'll wrap it up there, David. Well, thanks for that overview and taking us through those 4 separate trips. That was a really good way to get an impression of climbing and trekking in the Karakoram. So yeah, thanks for that, and we'll see you again.
Right. Goodbye.
Bye. So that was fantastic. So next week we're going to have one of our longest standing expedition leaders and mountaineering instructors with us, Mungo Ross, who many of you might have heard of or even climbed with or trekked with. Based in the Cairngorms, just north of Aviemore, Mungo has been involved in working in the outdoors for nearly 50 years. And Mungo is actually going to talk to us about Kilimanjaro, because he's been going there for many, many years, and he's going to talk about how the mountain has changed over that time, as well as all things that you might be interested to know about trekking to the top of Kilimanjaro. Now look out for further presentations, which will be announced on our news page and across various social media channels. And finally, if you've been following Alan Arne's virtual Everest 2020 coverage, you'll know that his superb blogs finished this weekend just gone. Alan has helped the companies who would normally have had Everest climbs this past spring raise over $50,000. Our campaign has now raised over £6,000, but we're still a bit short of our target of £8,848. So if you're able to donate, we really appreciate your support. There's the link there on the slide. So yeah, so that's it. Thanks for joining us for this session today, and we look forward to seeing you again and sharing some more stories about adventures in the mountains. Thank you.